Since time immemorial, humans have found more effective ways to fight one another. After the first cavemen found that beating somebody with a stick ensured success far more than beating somebody with their hands, it has been a constant battle to see who can come up with the most inventive means to perpetrate war. As weapons became more advanced, so did the tactics and strategies of the men that used them. I'm your host, a smart historian, and today we're going to be looking at a timeline of the infantry tactics and strategies behind warfare from the dawn of the pike and shot era to modern day. I will be discussing moments, developments, and people who changed the game and ranking them on a scale of -2 to +2, with negative numbers marking failures and positives marking successes. Before the firearm became widely used, the common infantry tactic of the late medieval/Renaissance was for infantrymen armed with pikes to fight one another. Opposing armies would engage one another's pike formations in spear fencing, which is fighting with the pikes at a distance, or in the push of pike, where two formations crushed against one another and the battle became a duel of sheer brute force. This was the long-standing way battles were fought on foot, until the Battle of Cerignola in 1503 ushered in a new era of combat. The French and the Spanish were engaged in a war over the city of Naples in Italy, and the Spanish were stationed in the nearby town of Cerignola. The French marched on Cerignola and attacked the Spanish, who were positioned atop a hill behind an earthworks. The French army, composed of pikemen and heavy cavalry, used their soon-to-be outdated tactics, sending their heavy cavalry forward. What is usually a decisive and destructive blow ended in failure, as unbeknownst to the French, the Spanish had armed many of their troops with the arquebus. A few years before the battle, the Spanish had been perfecting this gun, creating a matchlock system for their musket to fire. Cerignola was the first time it saw widespread use and a devastating effect. The Spanish sent wave after wave of French cavalry back with the power of the gun, and the few that made it to the Spanish line were met with a wall of pikes. When the French committed their infantry, the musketeers moved to the flanks and the pikemen engaged in a melee in the middle, with the muskets firing into them from either side. The French army was devastated and defeated, with the ingenuity of the Spanish firearms and formations guiding them to victory. This battle marked the beginning of the pike and shot era in Europe. The Spanish had used their guns and pikes in unison. The offensive power of the arquebus married perfectly to the defensive structure of the pike formations. The Spanish army became the dominant force as the inventors of this tactic, and soon the rest of the armies of Europe followed suit. Because of the failure of the outdated French tactics, I have ranked this as a -2 on the scale. A catastrophic failure that changed the battlefields of Europe for centuries to come. For 87 years after the victory at Cerignola, the Spanish reigned supreme on the battlefields of Europe. This lasted until 23-year-old military genius Maurice of Nassau, Statthalter of Holland and Zeeland, and Captain General of the Dutch army, reformed his forces. At the time, the Spanish owned the Netherlands, and Maurice of Nassau came from a family of rebels to this rule. He wanted to reform the army so that they could defeat their Spanish overseers once and for all. Maurice set about doing this by making the Dutch forces a standing army, rather than an army of conscripts. Soldiering became a profession, and with this came the standardization of pay, drill, arms, and armor. As these men were soldiers all year round, they had an unprecedented level of discipline and skill in battlefield maneuvers. Maurice also restructured the organization of his army, breaking it down into smaller, easier to control, and more mobile and versatile units of 550 pikemen and musketeers. The musketeers, who he positioned on the flanks, were trained in countermarch fire. The maneuver, which Maurice devised with inspiration from military treatises of antiquity, required the men in the first line to fire a volley, then retreat to the rear rank. The second line would then take their place and fire a volley, and then retreat to the rear rank as well, and so on until the first line, who by the time in which they returned to the first rank would have their muskets fully reloaded, and they'd fire once again, and begin the process anew. As the musketeers usually had 8 to 12 ranks, this tactic offered a nearly constant stream of volley fire from the musket formations. When faced with cavalry in battle, the musketeers would take place behind the protective wall of pikes. These reforms made the pike and shot system even more effective, and the Dutch army fielded by Maurice of Nassau successfully combated Spanish rule for over 2 decades. Thus, I have ranked this as a +1 in the success category of my timeline. Pike and shot dominated the European battlefield for about 150 years after its genesis at Cerignola. It became obsolete, however, with the invention of the bayonet for the musket in the mid-1600s. Since soldiers could now fix a bayonet to the end of their muskets, pikes became a thing of the past. To defend against cavalry, they would simply fix bayonets, rather than retreat behind the wall of pikes, as was the prior custom. Now every soldier was given a musket. They had both the offensive and defensive capabilities that required both a pikeman and musketman in one soldier. As every man now wielded a gun, the focus on the battlefield was to inflict as much damage as possible to the enemy, to maximize this potential firepower of hundreds of men wielding projectile death. Generals discovered that lining their men abreast in long lines did exactly that. These lines of muskets, side by side, firing volleys at their opponents, who did the same. The countermarch technique pioneered by Maurice of Nassau was implemented to deadly effect, and with developments to the musket technology, the reload time was also shortened. This meant most units employed 2 to 4 lines of muskets rather than the 8 to 12 of the earlier days. When cavalry charged the lines, they would simply break off into smaller, impenetrable squares, with the bayonets pointed outward like the spikes on a cactus. The bayonets also made the musket an adequate weapon in infantry melee, functioning just as a pike would in the same situations. By the late 1600s, the armies of England and Germany had abolished the pike in favor of the bayonet, and shortly after, the pike disappeared altogether from the battlefield. The bayonet brought about the tactical change from the old pike and shot squares to the line infantry. As a testament to its effectiveness, line warfare became a staple of battlefields for the next 200 years, and as such, it ranks as a 2+ on my timeline. Line warfare experienced a further improvement throughout the 7 Years' War and the American Revolutionary War. The untended, thick-forested land of North America was hard to fight in. The line was too long and unwieldy to contend with the rough terrain, and as such, the British Army had to adapt. The solution to this problem was to break the lines into smaller groups that could match the terrain they fought on. Line warfare finally became out of date in the early years of the American Civil War. With the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, armies could now quickly arm their soldiers with more effective weaponry. Muskets were improved to the point at which a man could fire 3 rounds a minute with more accuracy than ever before, and the Gatling gun made its appearance as well. It was quickly realized during these early battles that hundreds of men walking in a long line were too easy a target. Many battles were lost and many units decimated because of this. Additionally, the defense that the line infantry offered against cavalry didn't matter anymore, as the machine gun made the cavalry charge virtually ineffective. The Americans adapted to trench warfare in the latter years of the Civil War. More on that later. But elsewhere in the world, the line stuck around until further improvements on the machine gun made the tactic entirely futile. For this reason, it's ranked a -2 on the timeline. With the death of line infantry, the new tactic was to dig trenches and build fortifications. These were not a new idea, but to build vast networks of them to shield your entire army was. The firepower of armies became too great, such that men now needed a solid defensive structure to shield themselves from the onslaught of artillery and machine gun fire. The trench offered a massive gain in protection, but a huge loss of mobility for the soldiers involved. The tactics became much more about grabbing and holding land with these defensive implements, which would often be achieved by a mass, near-suicidal charge over the no-man's land between each fortification, in an attempt to rush the enemy's defenses and claim their trench as your own. With nations getting richer with industry and able to supply more men with more weapons, battles became massive, with millions of men fighting one another over battlefields that spanned many miles. The tactics of trench warfare were first used in the latter stages of the American Civil War, but were really perfected in the First World War. Since they changed war drastically to resemble more of the modern aspects and involved numbers of men unseen ever before in history, I ranked it as a 2+ on the success scale. War in the trenches only stayed popular for so long, though, with the invention of the tank and the airplane negating the defensive capabilities of the trench. A tank could plow through the machine guns virtually unscathed, and the plane could drop bombs on the men inside the trenches with ease. As the tank made its first appearances in the latter years of the First World War, it didn't yet have the profound effect. However, during the opening stages of the Second World War, the idea of a stationary, dug-in defensive position was exposed. The Maginot Line in eastern France, though not a trench in the traditional sense, was a massive fortification spanning the French and German border. This so-called impenetrable barrier was designed so that an army on the offensive would find it nearly impossible to break through, and that in the event of a breakthrough, the majority of infantrymen stationed on the line would be able to pull back and join the fight, as there would be no way the entire line would be broken, thus leaving the infantrymen time and safety to regroup. The line had a major flaw, though, as the designers saw the Ardennes forest to the north as a natural barrier that no army could break through with speed, leaving France time to muster its forces. During the Blitzkrieg, the German army spread through the Ardennes with their tanks, completely bypassing the Maginot Line and getting into France. It was the speed of the vehicles that showed the futility of the mobile defenses. The Germans simply moved around it without a fuss. Not long after, the German army took France. It is because of this failure of stationary defenses like trenches that I rate this a -2 on the failure scale of the timeline. After the blockades of the early 20th century failed, warfare became mechanized. The role of the infantry changed. No longer were there big sweeping maneuvers called by generals. Working in unison with vehicles to provide them with support and transport, the infantry became fast-moving units who fought skirmish-style combat, that is, without formations. The tactics were now on a smaller scale, with the brilliance of captains and sergeants offering victory rather than the grand sweeping offensives commanded by generals, as it was before. In this way, the role of every infantryman was now to disrupt the enemy and do the majority of house-to-house fighting in urban settings. This looser structure allowed the infantry to take advantage of terrain and match the more mobile warfare brought on by the introduction of vehicles to the modern battlefield. This is how the infantryman operates to this day, as warfare has become even more mobile and fluid with the advancements in technology. Therefore, I rate this as a 2+ on the success scale. It is evident that since the earliest days of pike and shot, the tactics of the common infantryman have changed drastically. This change correlates exactly alongside the great leaps and bounds in technology and thought that occurred over the 600-year period. It is not surprising that in the time which has seen the most development of those two aspects has also seen the most innovations in tactics as well. As the world progresses into the future, one can only wonder what the role of the common infantryman will be in the years, decades, and centuries to come.